Great. Okay, do you want to introduce me, or do you
Yes, sir.
just begin?
Either way.
Okay, well, anyway, I guess I'll just say I need no introduction. I'm Chris. Actually, maybe I do. It's been a while. I'm Chris Pearson. I have been around the department department and school. That goes back that long. Off and on since gosh, 1980, when I was a PhD student, Basil Jones's time in 1989. And this moved on to various other capacities and always seemed to come back. This is about something rather extraordinary that happened in 2014 through 2000 and really up through 2023, and in some cases, some ways, it's still ongoing. Um, um, the it is about it's more than me. This is about a collaboration that and a very successful technology transfer project that developed after the Gorka earthquake. Um, and I'd just like to explain what happened. I was sort of prompted because I had a contact from Winston Peters' office a few months ago during his trip to Nepal. And I realized we'd never really told the story here. And I thought, well, we should. So, and luckily, Young was nice enough to give me a platform to do it. So we'll see how it goes. But okay, before I start, I just want to make it clear this is not all about my work by any means. I was just one member of a team, a group. It involved the University of Otago, LINS, and the MFAT, some people in MFAT who were absolutely critical to making this work, and also some extraordinary people I had the good fortune to meet at the Survey Department of Nepal, Survey Department of Nepal, and who have just been wonderful to work with, and have taken the opportunities that came up, not from entirely from what we've done, but from over the years to develop what is one of the strongest, I think, geodesy programs in South Asia. Okay, anyway, so how did all this start? Well, it's all this guy's fault. That is Roger Billam, Professor Roger Billam from UCAR. He's actually a good friend of New Zealand. Paul Dennis's work in the Southern Alps transect, who don't think anybody here was involved in. I think it was before everybody's time except Paul Dennis. But he came out as part of that. He started an absolute gravity program. And then he finally got some more money to come back in 2014. And well, if you knew Roger, you wouldn't be surprised. He just kind of turned up, assuming there was somebody to be there. It was right before Christmas. And so calling for out volunteers, you're going to have to give up some of your Christmas leave. And well, the silence was deafening. So after a bit of umming and ahhing, I put my hand up. And a few weeks later, I met again Roger in Christchurch, and well, things didn't entirely work. And over some cups of tea, we were just talking, and one of the things I had in my mind at that time was that I would use my presence in New Zealand after having come back from the U.S. To help the island countries develop new datums. And I explained this to Roger. Now, that never worked. But Roger remembered me, and Roger being Roger, was in Nepal, I think during, but certainly immediately after the Gorka earthquake 2015, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake, almost exactly the same size as the Kaikoura earthquake, interestingly enough. And he remembered me, and he was talking to the prime minister. That's Roger all over the place. And he just can walk into a country and talk to the most amazing people. And he suggested that they talk to me about redefining the geodetic datum. And so I got a call out of the blue on Saturday Actually, I probably Christina will remember this because I told her. And well, we had plans for the weekend, but they all went out the window. I just spent the whole time sending the stuff that Roger wanted, and with one thing and another, a few months later, there I was in Kathmandu. And so now this isn't entirely science. I want to give you a little bit of a feel for the flavor of this. So I've got to get this thing moving. Next one. There we are. Anyway, I arrived in Kathmandu. Now the earthquake was quite a devastating earthquake. It's a huge earthquake, and the as we'll see a bit later, the epicenter was actually at the a little bit out of the Kathmandu Valley, so 20 or 30 kilometers. I said I didn't look it up. Away from Kathmandu, but there was a huge amount of ground movement. And also, I don't want to trivialize. This was quite a devastating earthquake. I think 9,000 people were killed tragically, but um, it's actually about 10 times the death rate from the Christchurch earthquakes, I figured. So it shows you how significant it was. Um, but and so what did I find? I arrived about 2 months after the earthquake, expecting to find something more kind of like Christchurch, but it wasn't anything like that. There was a lot of damage. This actually is one of the historic palaces in Kathmandu. Obviously, very badly knocked around. Um, and this is near Kathmandu Durbar. Uh, these are two buildings that were leaning towards each other, so they just braced them against each other. And amazingly, people were still using those. And when I was there in 2023, it's exactly the same. So there's a little bit of a different philosophy in dealing with earthquakes in Kathmandu than in New Zealand. Um, However, one of the things that when I arrived, I, what am I in the wrong city? This was this is a typical street scene. This is actually from near only a few kilometers from the Kathmandu Durbar Square for people who are familiar with it. And it's not uh, life is going on. It's pretty much as normal. The buildings were pretty much. I don't know. I'm not an earthquake engineer, but there were some buildings that collapsed. But as a general rule, most of the city was standing. You were in a functional city, nothing like Christchurch. And well, anyway, um, but that wasn't the only thing that was going on. Um, there was a new constitution. This was a time when there had been a civil war for quite a long time in the end of the monarchy and up through about 2014. But I'm not sure when it started, but there was a long-standing civil war. Uh, then, of course, the king, the Nepal royal family, was assassinated by the crown prince. Um, and that left the need for a new government. There was a constitutional convention that all came together. That all basically came together in September. It was about a week after I arrived, and um, uh, the new constitution was greeted with a huge amount of enthusiasm, lots of parades. This is the Nepal Maoist Party. Uh, and a huge burst of patriotic enthusiasm, particularly since, of course, it's the end of the Civil War. And this was just a street scene. I just walked around the eve of the new Constitution being promulgated. You saw this everywhere. I used to know what this said, but I don't anymore. But it's something like, we greet the new Constitution or a new day from the fall. Oh, and I ran into these two really, three actually. I think the girl was part of that group. Three really patriotic Nepali kids who actually insisted I take that photo. So I did, and I said I'd show it in New Zealand. So I'm doing it before Sarah, probably at university at this point. And but then um, the new constitution did not mention, got rid of the position of Hinduism as a state religion. And that was not okay with the Indians. And so there was I believe this is true. I don't want to, misrepresent things. I'm not an expert in Nepal's history, but that was my interpretation of it anyway. But anyway, regardless of what happened, this is what happened. There was a blockade was put on the border. It lasted from September 23rd through to early February of 2016. So, and of course, this is right at the beginning of my visit, more or less. That is what happened. The Nepal depends on imports of Indian petroleum, and a few, maybe 2 or 3 days after the blockade was formed, this ends up being every single taxi, every single bus in Kathmandu. They were all lined up along this one 4-lane road. Goes for miles. And of course, everybody's been to Kathmandu. Well, people use motorcycles. Yep, well, there they are. There was just, so what happened? Well, I was the only way to get around was walking. So I ended up walking from my hotel, which was sorry, I can't, Shangri-La, to the Survey Department, which is over by the airport. It's about an hour and a half walk. And so I was doing that twice a day. But anyway, it was actually not such a bad thing. I desperately needed the exercise. So, okay, now enough of the historical context. What 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 do we actually do? Well, the purpose of of this exercise was to try and develop a new datum for Nepal. And now, so why did Nepal need a new datum, and why was the earthquake a driving force for this? Um, First, what do we have? What did Nepal have to begin with? Nepal actually had quite a good datum, really, for the much better than Indians, much better than Indian datum. Um, it was developed by the UK Army engineers as part of a project. And once again, this was very much in collaboration with the Survey Department of Nepal. In Nepal, the Survey Department has always been very serious about capacity development, and so this was another exercise that they took full advantage of. It developed in the late 70s. It made use of the early EDM technology. That funny thing up on the upper right-hand corner is that, and of course triangulation. Went on for about 4 years. There's a fantastic paper about it. Really gives you a feel for what was involved. And I've known lots of people who've been involved in this. But people would actually spend, once the project was finished, people would spend sometimes weeks walking back to Kathmandu, because at that point, that was the way you got around in Nepal, and it was well before the modern road network was developed. Um, so, what was the problem with this datum? Well, it it had a few deficiencies. It had no mechanism to correct for crustal deformation. It was a static datum. No, that was what everybody did at that point. The idea of a semi-dynamic datum like we have in New Zealand hadn't really been developed. So there was no way to correct for crustal deformation. I suspect we'd probably happily still be, or the Nepal would still be happily using this datum, except for, of course, the tremendous amount of crustal motion that occurred after the Gorka earthquake. Um, And to correct for that, we needed some sort of a model, and we also needed an epoch date to uh, um, correct the coordinates, latitudes and longitudes back to. Sorry, there we are. In effect, the it was it basically wasn't GPSable. The GPS works on the ATRF. The ground marks had all shifted by up to a couple of meters. Well, of course, they weren't in position as far as GPS was concerned, and so all that had to be adapted, or had to be compensated for by distortion. And it was quite difficult to do when you're looking at meters, and also over a very short area. So everything, all of the layers, all of the data sets that were tied to this datum ended up being equally distorted. Now, our idea was to take something based on the New Zealand NZG 2000 datum, which was 14 years old at this point, well established, world leading, and take that technology and also critically the software that LINS had used to promulgate and develop this and use this in Nepal. And this is something that hadn't been done before. So once again, I've got to. There are lots of other people who need to be thanked, but I certainly want to thank Chris Crook from LINS, who was very helpful in my help me, figure out how to take particularly the Survey Net Adjustment Program, SNAP. I usually have to explain what that is, but you all know what that is. But it turns out that is actually can be easily uh, uh, um, redeveloped, or we can implement other datums besides NGD 2000 in it, and I took full use of that. Um, so, so how does this datum work? Well, you all know this really. The idea is that GNSS works, of course, using the ITRF and all of the satellite, but all of the space-based techniques, but GNSS particularly. Um, the national datum is defined using a network of continuous GNSS stations, think positions stations. Well, we didn't have that, but luckily there was a network at that point of scientific stations that were run by UNAVCO. And so we made full use of that and kind of adopted those as at least a proxy for the continuous network for Nepal, and uh, and then well, we had to develop the National Deformation Model. I'll say more about that later. That was a lot of the scientific interest. We adopted 1st of January 2016 as the epoch date. That was about September. No, it was April 15th. So about 8 months after the earthquake. The point is, it was behind us, so we didn't have to deal with the question of reverse patches versus forward patches, which New Zealand's has to, because of course we've had a whole bunch of earthquakes after the epoch. That made it a lot simpler. And what else? Um, and since we were starting with a clean slate, we could have well, we had to develop coordinates for our control points in this new frame. We'll talk about how we did that, and but these were all precisely in terms with the ITRF at that epoch date. So there were minimal distortions, and so we had a pretty good system for that. Okay, how does the National Deformation Model work? Well, natural deformation models, as I think you all know, um, are a model of crustal deformation. And for our points of view, there were three things that are important. Actually, pretty much that's true of New Zealand. Um, there's the velocity, the velocities which are defined by a grid. The idea of the velocities is they do not change, so they're secular velocities. We didn't have any time varying velocities. That's something that the paradigm will deal with, but we didn't incorporate that. And then, of course, we need models of earthquake deformation, earthquake shifts. And those are called earthquake patches. And so the green lines show, in a very idealized way, the sort of deformation we had in Nepal. It turns out there are two earthquakes. There's which we used, really only two significant ones, the 2015, the April 2015 Gorka earthquake, and then a magnitude 7 aftershock. And both we incorporated both of those, and that was all. And it's still pretty much all that's needed. There haven't been any significant earthquakes in Nepal since then. Um, And of course, we need the epoch date, and that's 2016.0. If we're taking coordinates which are determined at well now or what whatever now is, whenever you're making your measurements, we call it the epoch of measurement. Uh, we just simply need the velocities to project backwards. So that's simple. If we're using pre-earthquake measurements, and we want to bring those into the 2016.0 reference system, we have to use the earthquake patches. And we actually did that. Well, you'll see that in a few slides, but it worked quite well. And that gives us the coordinate in the modernized datum. I don't know what was, so okay, so what do we need? Well, we need a model of velocities. That's the most critical thing. And those are determined using normally, well, in LINS, it's been determined by genus science, with a lot of support actually from the University of Otago in the South Island and Paul's work. Um, but there's a scientific body that will do that for you and basically delivers a velocity grid to LINS. We didn't have that. So what were we going to do? Oops. No, luckily I was at the IUGG that year. So I walked around and asked some advice from Jeff Freimuller, particularly, if anybody knows Jeff. I think there are people who know him. And he was very generous with his time and said, oh, well, you should look after these papers. And so I did. And luckily, four of them, actually the most important four, put their measurements and their velocities in the paper. So I just used cut and paste and brought them into Excel. There's not much more to it than that. Reformatted them a bit and then used the GMT package. I think a lot of people who are familiar with that. It also has a gridding package. I just gridded them there. I played around with trying to optimize the parameters, and that's how we developed the secular velocity field. Now, as you can see here, there are four critical sets of velocity measurements. But, and this is a bit of a surprise to me, one of the things with velocities is that there are almost always alignment issues. You can generally take different people's surveys of positions and just combine them. You don't have to worry too much about combining as long as they're precisely located with the ITRF, as all of these were. They were very, very carefully done. But velocities are much trickier because they're derivatives. And so it's really easy to get little biases. And you can see what happens here. These are the We're just taking two sets of measurements. In each case, we have three measurements, and the red ones are always counterclockwise to the blue ones. And you'll see that for almost any of these groups. So we need some way of aligning this, taking these out. Uh, well, luckily, I'd actually spent 10 years at the NGS just a few years before this, and my colleague there, Rich Snay, had developed a really cool program to go through a data set, find points where we had overlaps between a critical foundation data set, and of course that's the ITRF, and all these others. And then they'll use the overlaps. That doesn't have to be overlap with the ITRF. They'll also take care of overlaps with any two measurements, and then solve for the differences. So this shows all of the velocity measurements we had. Now, luckily, again, I'm just mentioning, if any of you are doing velocity measurements, please publish your velocity measurements, and also put the velocities that you get for ITRF stations in your compilation, because this is what allowed this to work. We we basically could go through. I went through the data sets. I found all of the points which had ITRF and another station. Okay, and that's what these are. That's what these red dots are. I know one thing you can look at that with global coverage. That's another really critical thing. And we were really lucky because these weren't designed for this, right? But luckily it was fine. And then using sort of a bootstrap procedure, we'd orient every station that had enough measurements with the ITRF, and then of course the ones which just overlapped generally have overlaps only with other measurements and not very many ITRF stations. Those would be fitted to that. The program does it all automatically and produces a series of mini transformations between all of these effectively slightly different reference frames. And so we can convert everything to the ITRF. Now, how much difference does this make? Because I was surprised. Well, so I went down and I said, well, what happens if I don't do anything? What happens if I say they're all the same? This is the residual we get in millimeters per year. Surprisingly, it doesn't make a lot of difference in the east. What have I got here? East. Oh, yeah. It doesn't make an awful lot of difference in the east. It improves things. If the without alignments are the ones where we're not using this procedure, with after alignments are the ones we do. So, it does make a difference, but it makes a huge difference in the north. And so without that, we could still develop a velocity grid, but have a lot more error. And of course, remember, these are millimeters per year. So over 10 years, 3 millimeters a year ends up being 3 centimeters. So that's worth spending some time to try and eliminate these errors as much as you can. Okay, so we did that, and it was generally successful. So after that, it was fairly simple. I just took the velocities that came out. I won't go through the details of our gridding procedure, but we just used the GMT's gridding capabilities, and we ended up with a 20 point per degree velocity grid, only showing 2 points per degree here because you can't see it. It ends up being red if I showed them all. And but you can very nicely see we've got a smooth velocity field, and it shows a transformation between the Indian plate velocity and something beginning to approximate the Eurasian plate velocity. Okay, how are we doing? But that is only part of the problem. We still need a model of the earthquake, or what generally in New Zealand we call the earthquake patch. Now I got this using some unpublished, although I have since been published, dislocation models. The ones I used were for the best ones that I found were from a colleague of mine, I can't remember his first name, Professor Wang from UCSD for the Yehuda Box group, and he was nice enough to share that with me. And so basically, we just simply took these dislocation models. Dislocation models, for people who aren't familiar, are models of how the land shifts during an earthquake. They're used by seismologists to try and understand how the faults are actually moving. But they do give us something we can use to kind of to predict or to basically predict the actual motion on the surface. That's all we care about, and then using a forward solution of this, we can determine the motion at a grid of points, and that's basically the whole story of what we did. This shows a grid using 20 points per degree, I believe, and but that's fairly coarse. You can see that the pixelation in the central zone. There's a lot of detail we're not following. So in the center, we used 10 times the resolution, and so we've ended up with two nested grids, coarse grid on the outside, and a high resolution grid in the middle. And then two other things about this. Well, that gave us a grid, but the other thing which Lynn's developed, and it's a really useful procedure, NGS doesn't use this. It's really useful to apply a taper to the grid, because the thing is that when you get to the edge of the grid, it's going to end at some point. But the predicted deformation field never naturally goes to zero. But the problem with that is that if you just simply stop the grid, okay, you're at one end of it and you step across it, maybe you've got a couple of maybe 3-4 millimeters left, and then some poor guy is making a measurement between a point just inside and just outside, you're going to end up with the 3 millimeter bust in your line. Well, that's not really what anybody wants. So the New Zealand procedure, and I just basically adopted it, was to apply a taper for the last 0.2 of a degree, so it'd been about 20 kilometers, and just arbitrarily bring it down to zero. And this shows the how that works. With the taper, you end up with the faint, I should use the colors the other way, faint light green lines, and with when the taper was not applied, you end up with the bright blue. So without that, you'd have a 4 millimeter distortion at the end of every line at this particular point. By the way, I think it shows here. Yeah, there's a line of cross section for that. Okay, so with all that, we ended up with a deformation model. Pretty much everything we wanted. Oh, I haven't mentioned, we did put a small post-seismic relaxation in it, but it's pretty trivial. Probably wasn't necessary, but it's there. Okay. Now, so we had to, well, how we have to use this somehow. And so my idea, and basically the deformation model was the first trip, and finding that what was needed. I came back to New Zealand. I worked with Paul to develop accurate coordinates for all of those UNAVCO stations. at the 2016.0 epoch. Paul did it using his the Bernice program, and all the data was available on the UNAVCO website. And then but we needed survey measurements for the first order, at least the first order network. And luckily, once again, the Survey Department of Nepal had gone around and made measurements over about, what is that, 2000 and, I think it went about 2006 to 2000 and, well, there were some after the earthquake, 2018, over a 12-year period. And we were able to take these measurements. These measurements really weren't designed for this sort of survey, but we were able to combine them using the UNAVCO stations, and I actually processed them using the NGS's Pages software, and because I wanted something free and we wanted to something that we could leave behind, it also, this allowed us to combine all these because we had common points. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been any without the UNAVCO stations. Now, this is a map of all the baselines that we were able to develop. The red triangles are UNAVCO stations. So we have measurements from those, which were consistent across all the years. That wasn't quite that easy because they came and went, but we had to find ones that would work. And we have coordinates for these in the 2016.0 reference frame. So that's basically the way we proceeded. And so we ended up with a set of data that could be adjusted, and we adjusted them in Snap. This particular version of Snap we had been configured to use the new deformation model and support this new data from Nepal. And sorry, and well, okay, how good was it? Unfortunately, I've chosen a rather bad scale here. I didn't notice, but you can see the error bars for the heights, the error bars for the horizontal error ellipses are just too small to show, but we do show the combined statistics, and the RMS residuals from that came out at about a centimeter in the east and north, and 5 centimeters in the vertical, which I think really, given the type of measurements that were made, given that these really weren't designed for control, given the fact there was a whopping big earthquake in the middle of this, because these are 2016 measurements, but the most of the measurements were pre-earthquake. A few were post. So the measurements, they're a very good test of the how well this procedure worked, and we were able to get quite consistent coordinates from that. And actually, I was in 2023. I went back to the Survey Department, had a meeting with the director, and he was quite interested to get all this original data, which I sent him. So I guess it's still being used. Okay, now that was the first 3 years. Oh, I should mention one other thing. A mea culpa. If you're ever in Nepal, please check out festivals. I planned the second year of my project, so with enough time for to work with a couple of survey officers, explain the procedure. But I missed the design festival. It turns out the design festival, everybody in Kathmandu goes back home, goes back to their place of origin. Kathmandu completely shuts down. I didn't believe it, but they told me it was going to shut down. I didn't know about this until a few days before it happened. It shows good planning, right? I looked out the window after the first day. I, Kathmandu is a typical Asian city. Lots of traffic, lots of bustle. You could hear a pin drop. You could just actually take a nap in the middle of the street. It was that empty. And so I basically did all this in the hotel on my own. Not much takeout, not much capacity building was occurring. So I came back the next year and worked with a couple of survey officers in order to basically so that the procedures I used were well understood. And so that was quite rewarding. That was the third trip. Um, and then after that, another project came up. The survey department was asked to determine a new height for Sagarmatha or Mount Everest, and the we were talking about capacity building. I heard about this during my second and third trips, and oh God, you're kidding! It was just beyond belief. You're going to actually do this. The idea was a complete gravity survey around Mount Everest. That's challenging enough. I mean, this is not for the faint-hearted. There's a typical gravity survey point. Now, was not involved in any of the field work, but I was asked to come back and provide some training in both what I'd done and also at that point we had a sort of a buy-in from Trimble, and they were willing to give some equipment, and so I brought TBC along and discussed how they would use that. And oh, just one other thing about this. Their idea was to use combine classical and GNSS technology. So it's actually very similar to the survey that Pascal did in Mount Cook, which now, of course, Pascal's survey was done before that. I think that the design of this survey was independent, although maybe influenced by him. But anyway, they did that. They did use both classical and GNSS technology. The blue in the map on the right shows the rays to the summit of Everest, and then the red ones are rays between points on the basically other points in the surrounding area. And of course, all these had GNSS on them too. Now, I was not involved in any of the processing in this. This was all done by the Survey Department of Nepal, as well as the gravity. And so what happened? What did they do? Well, they made thousands of gravity points to improve the geoid, recalculated the geoid, which is a major effort on its own. There was leveling because they wanted orthometric heights, so they leveled up to up to some of these observation points in the middle mountain area. Those are some of the ones connected by red. Now, that's not easy either. Survey of India had just re-leveled all of India at that point. And so they brought in new heights to these I think two border crossing points, and then the Nepalis, who have a very strong leveling program, took those and propagated those heights to the observation points. And of course, the advantage of the conventional is that they ended up with an orthometric height for the top of Everest, not only a ellipsoidal height. And so it happened. Well, so what did they do? Thousands of gravity points, leveling from the Indian border to 7 observation points, and those all propagated from 2 boarding crossing points. And that gave basically trig heighting to the summit. So we had orthometric heights, or the Survey Department of Nepal determined uh, um, um, orthometric heights for the summit of Everest. And then, in addition, there was ground penetrating radar because the summit of Everest is actually a permanent snowfield. So the state of the art on Everest determinations, it was originally done by the University of Trieste, was to actually measure the height of the rock underneath this. So that was done, and so that was that was they those are the measurements that they conducted, and it's not for the faint-hearted at all. This is a summit photo of Mount Everest during these measurements. That is the one of the receivers that the that Trimble, New Zealand. Sorry, yeah, it was Trimble, New Zealand, gave to the Survey Department for these measurements. Now, I just have take a segue because it's a good place to say, amongst the very useful contributions that New Zealand made to the Survey Department of Nepal when I was involved was a $170,000 gift from Trimble to the Survey Department, and that included this receiver, amongst other things, several copies of TBC, other receivers, and some of their total stations. And but this measurement, I know this guy. I forgot his name, unfortunately. Is a survey officer who accompanied he climbed Everest before. He was obviously a very keen mountaineer, but he went up. The idea, because there's a real problem if you're going to make a measurement on the summit of Everest, it's one of the most crowded places on the planet, believe it or not, on a nice day. And so they decided the only way to do this was to make the measurement at night. So they are making the summit measurement, um, and it all went off without a hitch. And I was absolutely staggered when I heard about it. I wasn't in Nepal at the time, and so what was the result? Well, this was done in coordination with China. There was an announcement. The height that they came up with was 8848.86. Now, there's actually a vodka produced in Kathmandu called 8848 because that was the conventional height of Everest. So it was a difference of about 8 tenths of a meter. I think everybody was surprised how close it was because, of course, it included crestal motion in the time. And so it's about 1 meter higher than the previous accepted value. And the rock height was 8844. So about 4 meters of ice on the top. And this is the geodetic team from the Survey Department at a geodetic observatory they maintain about an hour's drive out of Kathmandu. A few people I'd like to Dipesh, who's on the left-hand side, the young guy. Niraj Mandalar, he was my colleague. Those are the main ones I can, whose names I can remember now, and I don't want to massacre them. And okay, there's me. But it was just a huge achievement for the Survey Department to have been able to pull off that measurement and do it so well. Okay, well, we have stayed in touch. I got involved with FIG after this was, well, several years after this was over. and I met Dupish in at the Fig Working Week in no, sorry, the Fig Congress in Warsaw, and then last year at the this year, a few months ago at the Working Week, Mish, who was another one of the people I met, who was actually ended up being the key person for doing the height of Everest computations, was there. Now, just a few things about before I leave. One of the I've got a few minutes. One of the things which was really pleasing to see was because I was over there about 8 years after the earthquake, was I saw sort of the reconstruction and rebirth of the city, if you will, for the areas that really were devastated, which is the whole historic centers of Nepal. For the people who aren't familiar with Nepal, the Kathmandu is kind of a amalgam of three pre-Nepal kingdoms: Kathmandu, Patan, and Bhaktapur, and each one has a area of has a historic area. Sorry, this is the old palace, obviously knocked around by the earthquake. It would be gone by lunchtime, in New Zealand. Oh, that's it. That was it in 2023. Completely redone. I've been inside it. You've got, it's used for national celebrations, and just a few slides of some of the festivals. This is the Iran Jatra Festival. There's a cult of the living goddess in Kathmandu. She's actually, you can't see her very well, but she's the red young lady in red in this chariot, and being dragged by enthusiastic supporters. And that is the after having been done up, reconstituted along with everything else. That's the I think it's the vengeful chase of Shiva, and but anyway, the pipe is where a beer, which is specially brewed, is piped out during the festival, and of course, every teenager in Kathmandu is there. But anyway, that's all I have to say. So we'll stop.
Chris, maybe we have time for one quick question for the next class time. That we can continue with some other questions if you have any, maybe after
Sure.
cover. Yeah, any question? Actually, I have one.
Okay.
So, Chris, just now you mentioned about the post-seismic activities. So, like, what kind of magnitude you?
No, it was very small. It was nothing like you found in your. Well, of course, this is a much smaller earthquake than you were dealing with, but it was surprisingly small even for 7.8. Nothing like we had in Kaikoura. I don't know. I was amazed, but there was a study Roger Villen was involved with, and UCAR and UNAVCO, and then we added a few points for using Paul's analysis. But it was a few millimeters, maybe 5-6 millimeters for the amplitudes, and we basically used the exponential arithmetic log.
All right. So once again, thanks.
Okay.